May 19th, 1836. Dawn breaks over Parker's Fort in the red dust of East Texas. A 17-year-old woman, heavy with child, stands just inside the stockade and watches her world unravel. There is the sound of pounding wood, the shock of men being dragged and struck, the sudden and absolute silence where a house once held a family. She is seized, blindfolded, marched away. That morning would become a hinge in the lives of many on the frontier, a single moment that opens onto a much larger, harsher story. This is the shocking truth they did not teach in the tidy pages of school books. During the 19th century, the Southwest and Plains were places of systematic, often brutal raids, in which dozens and perhaps hundreds of women and children were taken. These were not random acts of chaos. They were part of a violent and complicated frontier economy and social order. Some captives were adopted, some were sold, some were ransomed, some died. Some came home broken. Others would never want to go back. Their voices, memoirs, court depositions, the testimony of rescuers and neighbors survive unevenly. They insist that the story of the American frontier is not simply one of settler triumph or indignious villainy, but a tangled archive of suffering, survival, and uneasy human bonds. If this subject matters to you, if you want more untold history drawn from primary testimony and careful scholarship, subscribe. There is more to unearth. To understand who was taken and why, we must set a scene. The frontier was a landscape of raids. Bands from the southern plains and the trans-Mississippi West, including Comanche groups, Apache raiding parties, and others, used lightning strikes to take horses, livestock, and sometimes people. These raids were tactical. They often came at dawn or dusk, when the men were away hunting or working, when families were most vulnerable. Raiders moved fast and knew the country. They killed who they needed to kill to break resistance. Usually men, boys too old to control captives, and the elderly who could not be moved. Women and young children, however, were often spared for specific reasons. Practical motives shaped selection. Women and girls provided labor. They could be integrated into camps as domestic help, making a captured household's northward march more sustainable. They could be incorporated through marriage into a band, forming political and kin ties. They could be traded to other tribes, sold in distant markets, or held for ransom. Children were prized both for their labor potential and for the symbolic power of assimilation. Raising a settler child in a new cultural setting could extend influence and mend battlefield losses through kinship. Raiders were not operating in a moral vacuum. They were acting within an economy where horses, captives, and trade goods circulated, and where reprisals and long-standing enmities shaped choices. We must guard against caricature. Not every member of any tribe acted the same way. Comanche society in particular was decentralized. Decisions were made by bands and war leaders, not a single sovereign will. Yet patterns recur in testimony. Survivors describe nights of terror as men were killed and women were rounded up. The cries of infants cut through the dust. A child who could not be moved was sometimes killed rather than left behind. Those selected were pushed onto long marches across difficult country. Some captives were taken hundreds of miles from their homes within a matter of days. Once captive, daily life varied, but often shared certain cruelties. The gauntlet was a ritual and a punitive spectacle. Captives were forced to run between lines of people, striking them with switches, cudgels, or fists as they passed. Accounts emphasize both the physical pain and the humiliation of the spectacle, a public marking of power. Food, when available, tended to go first to warriors and children. Captives were fed last, or subsisted on scraps. Labor began at first light and continued through the day, carrying water, gathering wood, tending animals, preparing hides. Sleep was precarious and brief. Discipline included both quotidian punishments and ritualized violence. Fire was used both as immediate threat and as method of torture. Scorched skin, brand marks, instances where captors heated irons or scalding liquids to coerce compliance. Testimony and memoirs, the fragmentary documents that form much of what we know, describe beatings for infractions that would seem trivial to an outsider, for failing to fetch water fast enough, for not understanding a command, for trying to escape. The purpose was not only enforcement, it was instruction. A captive who survived and integrated had to learn a new language, adopt new customs, and submit to a social order that could include harsh displays of dominance. There was also a spectrum of experience between outright brutality and genuine adoption. Some captives found places in their new communities, passed through domestic apprenticeship to roles that offered a measure of security, and were treated with kinship. Others were traded on market routes, linking plains bands to Mexican traders, or turned into chattel for members who profited from selling captives into slavery. Across this range, survival often depended on a captive's age, gender, and the needs of the captors. To make these patterns concrete, we return to individual lives, each different and each emblematic of the era's complexities. Rachel Plummer, often appearing in 19th century records as Rachel or Rachel, was taken during the Fort Parker raid on May 19, 1836. She was pregnant when seized. In her published account, written after her ransom and return, she left readers a stark impression of a woman seeing her family destroyed and then being drawn into a world of brutality and deprivation. For 21 months, she lived among her captors, and that time included the worst of frontier cruelties: the loss of a child, repeated beatings, forced labor, and the terror of daily uncertainty. Her narrative is notable not only for its detail, but for what she declines to narrate fully. Moments of experience she described as impossible to put into words in a public memoir. Her story has a particular wound. She was pregnant at capture and was forcibly separated from her infant. Contemporary accounts record that a child taken with her did not survive captivity. Rachel's memoir became a public document used by newspapers and pamphlets to underline the dangers of the frontier and to urge military responses. When she was eventually ransomed, she returned not only physically marked by the experience, but emotionally altered. She lived only a few years after her return. The exact interplay of illness, trauma, and circumstance that followed is part of what makes such narratives painful to read. Her testimony, however, stands as testimony itself, a voice insisting on what happened, even as she refused to give readers every detail. A different outcome emerged in the life of Olive Oatman, whose name would become the headline in a later decade. Olive was captured with members of her family as a teenager. She survived a series of transfers, from the band that first took her to other groups, until she was living among the Mojave people. The Mojave tattooed her face with the distinctive blue chin mark that would come to define her public identity. When she was finally released and returned to Anglo society, journalists and curiosity seekers flocked to see the woman who bore such a visible sign of her years among native people. Her image was paraded on lecture circuits. She became a kind of living exhibit used to sell sensation and sympathy. Yet Olive's life after that public exposure complicates any neat moral. The tattoo that fascinated white audiences also alienated her from the social world that claimed to be her own. She lived in a liminal, contested space, claimed by white people as a rescued victim, but marked by her time with the Mojave in such a way that full reintegration was impossible. Her case raises one of the most wrenching dilemmas of these captivity stories, the question of identity. Who owns a life lived across cultures? Olive's face made her a symbol, but symbols flatten complexity. Behind the spectacle was a woman who had experienced loss, adaptation, and the long-term consequences of a public that sought to define her. Matilda Lockhart presents another, grimmer episode. She was captured and later rescued with injuries that shocked contemporary onlookers. Her rescue testimony, as recorded in Texas accounts, describes severe burns and mutilation to the face and scalp. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Her condition was used to justify reprisal and harsher policies. Her suffering became an argument, mobilized to demand action. Yet the path from rescue to healing was uneven at best. Matilda's injuries had consequences that went far beyond what a single magazine or committee hearing could address. The physical and psychological scars lasted the rest of her life. She died, not long after being returned to settler society, and her case remained a touchstone for those who pointed to the brutality of frontier raiding. Perhaps the most complicated and contested of all is the life of Cynthia Ann Parker. She was a child of 9 when she was seized at Fort Parker in 1836. Unlike many captives, Cynthia did not cling to the life she had left. She adapted and fully assimilated into Comanche life. She married a Comanche man, often identified in sources as Peter Nocona, and bore children, the most famous of whom was Quanah Parker, who later emerged as a leader among the Comanche. Cynthia lived inside Comanche culture for roughly 2 decades. By the time she was encountered and forcibly separated from her family by Texas authorities in the late 1860s, she had no desire to return. Her recapture and rescue are a stark example of how rescue could be a second, perhaps more painful, captivity. Cynthia was taken back to Anglo society, and she grieved the loss of her Comanche family, even as the society that reclaimed her insisted she be grateful. She refused to abandon the language, the dress, and the ties she had formed. Decades of assimilation in her new home left her estranged from the world she had been born into. Her last years were marked by longing and illness. She died a few years after her forced return. Her son, Quanah, raised in Comanche culture, would become a symbolic bridge between 2 worlds, and his leadership would shape the Comanche response to reservation life and U.S. pressure. Cynthia's life forces us to ask whether rescue is always liberation, and to remember how intertwined trauma and kinship could become on the frontier. Across these lives, a pattern emerges. Captivity could mean death, enslavement, forced labor, or a painful and permanent change in identity. Yet it could also produce new kinship relations, in ways that later generations could neither simplify nor fully forget. By the 1870s, some historians have argued, a significant proportion of what were identified as Indian communities included people with settler ancestry. In some estimates, as many as 30% of certain tribal populations had captive ancestry. That number needs careful qualification. It depends on region, on how ancestry was recorded, and on practices of adoption and marriage. But it points to a demographic reality that complicates the usual binaries of settler and native. The economy of ransom and trade was central to this reality. Families and communities worked to buy back captives, and traders acted as intermediaries between bands and distant markets. Newspapers received letters and affidavits detailing ransom negotiations and returned captives. Journalists often sensationalized these accounts to attract readership. A captive like Rachel Plummer could be turned into a moral parable in print, emphasizing the vulnerability of women and the need for military protection. Olive Oatman could be transformed into a living curiosity, an object lesson for lecture halls and dime museums. Matilda Lockhart's injuries became a cause célèbre used to rally political support for reprisals. The press did not merely record events, it shaped how those events were remembered. Sensationalism amplified some stories and buried others, selecting narratives that fit a marketplace of fear, curiosity, and political argument. But the sources we have are themselves flawed and partial. Memoirs are shaped by memory, trauma, and commercial pressure. Court depositions were produced in legal contexts that required simplification and moral clarity. Rescuers' reports often reflected the political imperatives of the moment. For historians, reconstructing these lives requires triangulating these imperfect documents, comparing a published memoir to a deposition, to a newspaper account, to tribal oral histories where available. The result is never a single unambiguous truth. It is a textured, sometimes contradictory archive that nevertheless points toward real experiences. To illustrate the daily specifics of captivity, we turn to recurring themes in testimony. The gauntlet, which I mentioned earlier, appears in many accounts. A ritualized punishment and a means of reordering social relations. Survivors who later testified spoke of the fear of being forced through ranks of people who would not spare them a blow. Food scarcity is another constant. In accounts from multiple regions, captives recall being fed last, sometimes given only what was left after warriors and children ate. Starvation and exposure were not rare outcomes, and these conditions weakened the ability of captives to escape or resist. Labor was backbreaking, the repetitive work of daily survival. Carrying water, processing hides, tending animals, often left bodies scarred and minds exhausted. Punishments could be specific to cultural norms of the captors. Tattooing, for instance, carried different meanings across tribes. For the Mojave, the chin tattoo signified incorporation into community and could mark a person's status and belonging. For white observers who later encountered Olive Oatman, the tattoo was a mark of horror and otherness. Similarly, practices involving fire, whether as the threat of brand or as ritual punishment, were cited in numerous testimonies. These are grim details, and the temptation is to dwell on them. But the evidence requires restraint. Historians must report the harm without turning suffering into spectacle. Many survivors themselves refuse to give lurid descriptions, and that refusal has a moral force. It signals the limits of public consumption and the sanctity of what some experiences cannot be made into comfortable narratives. Another theme is the role of children. Young captives sometimes adapted more easily than adults. With language acquisition and socialization, children could become full participants in new communities. That made them, paradoxically, both survivors and the bearers of a complicated legacy. Rescues that returned children to settler families were often traumatic. Language loss, cultural disorientation, and divided loyalties created lifelong ruptures. Some children refused to go, others were taken by force. The phrase rescue as second captivity is more than rhetoric. It describes the pain of being uprooted twice. How did settler society respond to these realities? Responses varied, but several consistent patterns appear. One was the demand for military action. Public outrage at mutilation or the taking of children mobilized political pressure to punish raiding parties. Another was the commodification of captive narratives. Lecture circuits, periodicals, and pamphlets turned captives into moral examples. Women's testimony was persuasive precisely because it invoked domestic vulnerability, a narrative useful to those advocating for protective measures and territorial expansion. In that sense, captivity stories served multiple agendas. They rallied settlers, justified reprisals, and normalized expansionist policies under the banner of protecting white women and children. At the same time, some settlers viewed ransom negotiations and market exchanges as necessary evils. Families raised funds, pooled resources, and engaged intermediaries to retrieve loved ones. Traders and intermediaries could sometimes broker releases. At other times, they profited from the traffic. The children and women who returned often came back into households reshaped by absence and loss. Physical injuries and mental scars complicated reunions. Families could be financially or emotionally depleted by the process. Rescue was often framed as closure, but in lived reality, it was commonly only a beginning of new wounds. The historiography of these events has evolved. 19th-century writers and newspapers often cast captors in monolithic terms and treated captives as innocent victims in a stark binary. Early historians of the West echoed that binary. Settlers were free and virtuous, indigenous peoples savage or cruel. Over the last several decades, scholars have complicated this picture emphasizing the reciprocal violence of frontier life and the agency of indigenous groups in defending land, pursuing economic advantage, and incorporating captives into kinship systems. Historians now stress that captivity could be a form of adaptation as much as aggression, and that individual cases must be assessed in local contexts. That complexity does not erase suffering. It does, however, prevent us from reducing history to a single moral sermon. When a child like Cynthia Ann Parker becomes a genealogical bridge between cultures, historians must reckon with kinship, with children reared in ways that blended practices, languages, and loyalties. When Olive Oatman becomes a public curiosity, we must ask how communities used her image. When Matilda Lockhart's injuries became cause for retaliation, we must consider the policy consequences that flowed from individual trauma. There are also uncomfortable truths about how these stories circulated. Newspapers and popular accounts selected the most shocking elements and amplified them. Pamphlet revisions of memoirs sometimes added dramatic flourishes to sell more copies. Lecture promoters shaped narratives to appeal to audiences hungry for tales of suffering and triumph. When a returned captive put her story on the public stage, her voice was filtered through editors, printers, and impresarios. That means the archive is not only a record of events, it is a record of how people wanted those events to be perceived. At the same time, the voices of the captors and the people who received captives are scarce in written form for many of these cases. Tribal oral histories, where available, add crucial context, but have too often been ignored or undervalued. Where scholars have sought out indigenous perspectives, the historical picture deepens. Raids were responses to encroachment, competition over buffalo and horses, and long histories of intertribal conflict and diplomacy. Killing, capturing, and trading people were strategies that had been deployed in many societies. On the frontier, they intersected with the expanding markets and militarized conflicts of the United States and Mexico. The legacies of these events remained visible into the late 19th century. Bands and families that included captives or the descendants of captives navigated new social orders brought by reservation policies, treaty-making, and military campaigns. Some former captives or their children occupied mediating roles. Others were marginalized. The demographic fact of intermixing challenged simplistic narratives of racial purity beloved by many 19th century commentators. It also complicated property claims and politics of belonging. In many communities, the presence of river white or mixed ancestry people was an ongoing source of social negotiation and tension. As historians, filmmakers, and audiences, we have an ethical obligation when we tell these stories. The survivors were, above all, witnesses. They spoke, often painfully, to testify that something happened. That testimony deserves careful treatment. It ought not to be reduced to sensational headlines, nor stripped of context that explains why these acts occurred and how they fit into a broader frontier order. It also requires humility. The archive is partial, memory falters, and the living descendants of both captives and captors deserve respect. So what is the shocking truth? It is multi-layered. There is the brutality, forced marches, the gauntlet, beatings, the theft of children. Those are factual elements that appear again and again in testimony. There is also a truth about agency. Some captives resisted, some escaped, some adapted and formed new families and identities. There is a truth about spectacle, how American audiences consumed captivity narratives, and how those narratives shaped policy and memory. And there is an uncomfortable truth about reciprocity and complexity. Frontier violence was entangled, and to understand it is not to excuse it, but to situate it in a tangled historical reality. Remember Rachel, carried from Parker's Fort with a baby at her breast and kept for nearly 2 years. Remember Olive, whose tattooed chin became the currency of public curiosity. Remember Matilda, whose injuries forced a public confrontation with brutality. Remember Cynthia Ann, whose life was split between two worlds and who died longing for the family she had made. These women were not mere symbols. They were human agents with stories that contest easy moralizing. As we close, we must return to responsibility. Telling this history asks that we avoid voyeurism. We should not dwell on the brutal to titillate, nor should we flatten these lives into cautionary parables convenient for modern biases. The right approach is careful listening, to memoirs, to court records, to oral histories, and a willingness to accept ambiguity. Survivors sometimes refuse to narrate everything. That silence is telling. It is part of the record. If you want to keep exploring reliable histories about this period, consider seeking out well-researched works and primary sources. Published memoirs and affidavits from the era, modern scholarly treatments that synthesize those testimonies with indigenous perspectives, and archival collections that preserve depositions and correspondence. Look for books that grapple with both the violence and the complexity of the frontier. In the description below, we have listed several recommended readings and primary sources you can consult. The title promised a shocking truth. The shock is real. The frontier demanded cruelty as a tactic and survival as a constant imperative. But the larger truth is the messiness. Captivity produced both devastation and new forms of life. Rescue could be relief and an additional wound. Public memory could become both witness and weapon. To remember these women is to commit to a history that honors survivors' voices without simplifying their experiences. If this video resonated, please like and share. And if you want more deeply sourced histories, subscribe for future episodes. In the description, you will find a short bibliography of primary narratives and modern scholarship to begin your own reading. Published memoirs from survivors, collections of court testimonies, and recent historical analyses that place these stories in a broader context. They were held. They survived, in varying degrees. Their stories are part of the frontier's unfinished inheritance, a human record of violence, adaptation, and memory that continues to shape how we understand the American past. The shocking truth is not a single headline. It is the tangled legacy left behind, and our obligation now is to listen, learn, and remember with care.